Hello everyone and welcome to the Africa Museum podcast, the podcast channel for the Royal Museum for Central Africa in Belgium. My name is Gabrielle Fenton, and for this series I've been walking around the museum's labs, offices and archives to meet with scientists who work here. Each scientist had to choose one object that is somehow related to their research. It could be an object that they have worked on or with, or an object that simply carries a bit of their passion for their field. Some of these objects are on display in the museum, others belong to the nitty-gritty of everyday research. All of these objects have an interesting story, and that is what we are out to find out. Is it possible to hear the voices of the speakers of Bantu languages 50 years ago through the scribbles of a linguist? A lot of research in the museum is based on fieldwork, and notebooks are crucial to fieldwork. But what do scientists actually write in their notebooks? And what do they write that doesn't find its way into academic articles? Let's find some answers to these questions by taking a closer look at an old notebook with Maud de Vos, who is a linguist here at the museum. Africa Museum podcast. Okay, hello Maud. How are you today?
I'm fine, thank you.
So we're here to talk about a special notebook. Would you like to describe to us the notebook?
Yes, well, it's a little old-fashioned notebook, and it's got a note on it saying that it's a Lega notebook. And it's full of notes in pencil and in pen. It's entirely numbered. Even the cover is numbered. And it's full of language notes. And the language notes are by Meusen. He was the first linguist in the Africa Museum.
And so how old would this notebook be?
This particular notebook, well, on the first page we can see the date. It started on the 5th of September in 1955, so it's from 1955, yes.
And where would it have been, where would Meusen have been taking the notes for it?
When he took the notes, he was in the Democratic Republic of Congo and in the eastern part in the Maniema region, doing field work. He was working on the languages spoken in that region, and one of those languages is Lega.
And so Meusen, you said, was the first linguist here at the museum. When you read these notebooks, what do you find out about Meusen as a person? What kind of a man was he?
Well, that's a good question, because actually, how do we know Meusen? He was a very important Bantuist, so working on Bantu languages, and we know him, as every scientist, through his publications. But his publications tend to be very concise, so he was a scientist who never wrote one word too many. And so for a non-linguist, it's impossible to read his articles and his grammars. For a linguist, it might even be hard, because there's nothing too much. There's not one explanation that is not needed. I mean, so you have to be very independent to read his publications. But then in the notebooks, you see a different person. You kind of see how he worked, how he went about to study the language, and you also see the contact he had with the language consultants, so the people speaking the language, and you also see that he was very interested in the people speaking the languages and their culture. So there you get the frills and the extra things that are missing in the articles he wrote later on. So you get more information.
So is there any particular part of our writing in the notebook that you would like to share with us, or some of these extra notes that you're talking about?
Yes.
Could you show us some?
Yes. Well. First, I think, and it might be sometimes it's very short. You see, he has also written down some of the comments that the the people themselves had about his way of like if you do linguistic fieldwork, then usually you also try to make some sentences yourself. So if he's working on Lega, he would try to make a little sentence himself, and then he has written that down. But then the language consultant said, well, yes, c'est du Lega, mais pas vraiment du bon Lega. Donc, alors, so he said, like, well, that's Lega, yes, but it's not very good Lega. Or on another occasion, working on another language, it's Bangu Bangu language, then he says, he puts a note aside, like there was a form, chu, and he was working with a lot of language consultants, and then they all said it's chu, but then they all said it's tu, and one older man said, no, it's chu. And later on he said, well, okay, leave it be. So we make it tu. But these kinds of extra notes by where you hear the voice of the language consultant, the speaker of the language, are very nice. And you find them in the notebook, but not necessarily later on in the grammar.
Can you just explain to us what a language consultant is?
That's how we call it's actually our co-workers, the people speaking the languages we work on and that are essential to our research. We wouldn't be anywhere without them. So we get our information about the language from them.
I'm curious. Obviously, I'm not a linguist and I'm not a Bantu speaker either, and I'm guessing that a lot of people who are listening to this aren't either. So what would you say is why would non-linguist and non-Bantu speakers should be interested in Lega in the Lega language, for example, or in other Bantu languages?
Well, there's different reasons. One of the reasons is that a lot of these languages are oral languages. This means that they are not written down. So the fact of writing them down and taking notes of them means that there will always be traces of this language, and this language might disappear because there's a lot of urbanization going on in Africa, so a lot of people are moving around, they are going to bigger cities, and they might not speak the language of their village anymore. So that's the first reason. It's a trace of a language, and thereby also a trace of a whole culture. And but another reason is one of the things that I noticed when working with students or visitors to the museum, is that there's this persistent idea about African languages in general, and then more specifically about Bantu languages, that they are somehow simple languages, so primitive languages even. And so people often, and I don't say all people, but many people often think that African people speak like, well, I run church, and they don't inflect anything, and they just, by adding yesterday, make a past tense. And that's not true at all. These Bantu languages are very complex languages. I don't mean to say more complex than the languages we speak, but they have their own complex grammar, like any language has, and they are for us often even very complicated because they also have something like tone, so they're tonal languages, and so they make grammatical differences. For example, the difference between a past tense and a present tense they might make just by changing the tone. I don't know a Lega example, but I know an example from languages I worked on. Makwe is such a language. It's spoken in Mozambique. It's a Bantu language also, and there you would say, for a present tense, you would say nawena. But then if you want to make a past tense, and that means I am going, or I go, or I will go. But then if you want to make it in the past, you have nawena. And so that is I went, I used to go. So you have nawena and you have nawena. So, and it's only the tones that will teach you this difference. So for us, that makes it very complicated. And I think it's important. I mean, it changes the way people think about other people, and it might also learn us to respect other people a bit more.
And Musen was very good at picking up these tones, as I understand, right? Yeah.
Yes, he was a specialist. He was one of the best, and he also kind of, we know he chose his co-workers in function of their ability to hear tone. So if you were good in tones, then you might well have get a job with Mewson, but if you weren't, then that could be very difficult. Yes.
And so this notebook obviously is Mewson writing down language.
Yes.
But Lega is an oral language, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm just wondering, how is there a paradox in sort of writing down a language that is oral? Or are we losing something, or how do linguists go about that?
Well, as a matter of fact, writing down any language is losing part of it. I mean, we are so used to it that we don't think of that in those terms, but as soon as you write something down, you kind of, you make something that's always changing into something that doesn't change anymore. So that's what we do when we write it down, but often that's the only way to keep something, so to keep a trace of something. And as a linguist, what we are very careful about is that when we write a grammar, is that we take a synchronic view. So that means that it's one moment in time. So we work for Lega, for Mewson in the 1950s, and then so the way he describes the language is the way the language was spoken at that particular moment by those particular people. And he doesn't want to make a normative grammar. He doesn't want to say this is the way Lega is spoken and the way everyone should speak Lega. And that's how grammars of French and Dutch are often conceived. I mean, we just want to tell people how they should speak, but that's not the case with the way linguists write a grammar. They just say that's the way the language was spoken at that particular moment. And we don't think of anyone making any mistake. So nothing is a mistake. In normative grammars, often you feel like, oh, the way I speak is wrong, but it can't be if you make a synchronic grammar of a language. It's just the way it is spoken at that particular moment. And then ideally, well, Mewson also did that. He made recordings. So, and audio recordings, ideally now when we do the research, you also have video recordings. So you have the written version, but you can even see and hear the language being spoken, not only read the language being spoken. So you have everything, even movements of the body, of the hands. You can see everything that accompanies language use.
And I think Mewson has a kind of also describes this visual gesture part in his notebook, right?
Yes. Yeah, that's also a very nice part in his notebook. So yes, I think I see it here. So then he was working, for example, he works on every part of the grammar. So he has to go through nouns, demonstratives and everything, and also numbers. And I always find numbers extremely boring, like it's the mathematics entering the language, and I mostly don't like it. And so, but it's necessary. I mean, you have to record the language, so numbers are also spoken, so you put them in. But what Mewson did was that he also describes the way people sign numbers when with their fingers. So for every number from 1 to 10, he gives a description of how they hold their fingers to sign this number. And so, for example, the number 8 is not, I think most people here would put up one hand and show 5 fingers and put up a second hand and show 3 fingers to make 8. But the Lega people would show twice 4 fingers. For example, those are little differences, but you see he also writes that down, and actually that's just writing down something that is very visual in the notebook.
And so now a question that isn't really about Mewson, but more about you and how you've been a linguist for quite a long time now. Yeah. And I was just wondering, Is there, when you're in your everyday life here in Belgium, are there words or grammar structure from the Bantu languages that you study that you feel, if only I could use this word in this particular situation, and you can't because obviously it's not French or Dutch or English?
Yes, there's one particular word I think of, and I recorded it when doing research for my PhD that was in Mozambique on the Makwe language, a Bantu language. I stayed there a long time, twice 8 to 9 months, and I did most things together with the people to get the vocabulary. And so we went out working on the field one day, and we returned when the sun was setting. And so we went downhill, and suddenly, I don't know why, I turned around, and then what I saw was the last rays of the sun falling on top of the trees. And then it made me think of this kind of light in Brussels, when the last rays of the sun fall on top, not of the trees, but then of the buildings, and then underneath there's only shadow. And so I started kind of in an excited way explaining this to the woman I was working with, and I said like, I find this so beautiful, this last rays of the sun, and then everything else is already in the shadow. And then she just looked at me very simply and she said, well, yes, I know, Nanyanjijua. And I was so amazed. I thought like, well, I tried to explain this in like 10 sentences, and she just has one word for this thing that is so beautiful. And then I think, why don't we have a word? Because it is so beautiful.
What's the word again?
Nanyanjijua. It's a compound, so, and literally, but it's a compound, it's one word. It's a compound, as we like football is one word, but still you know what the different parts are. But it's kind of the side of the sun, but it's used really for these last rays of the sun. So very poetic actually, but we need a poem, they have a word.
That's very nice.
Yeah.
Wow, so that this is about the end of this podcast, but would you, if people would like to learn more or find out more about Musun or about Bantu languages, what would you recommend they do?
Yes, well, if they want to find out more about Mason, they really have to come to the Africa Museum, because I think that's the only place where they can learn more about him. There is a zone in the Africa Museum that's on languages and music, and in there's one showcase on Mason, because he was the first linguist in the museum, and he was a very important linguist for Bantuists all over the world now. And then also, well, this zone on African languages and on music is completely new in the museum. There was nothing of the sort in the old museum. There were music instruments, but they were displayed as ethnographic objects, and there was nothing about languages. So you can come to the museum and you can not only read things about Mewsum, but you can also hear Bantu languages being spoken, and you can also learn a bit about this complex grammar I was talking about. There's some games that show you how Bantu language works. So.
And I think you can see one of the notebooks also.
Yes,
is that right?
The notebook I have been talking about is displayed in the showcase on Mewsum, together with other articles by him.
Well, thank you very much. That was very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Africa Museum podcast. Goma, in the DRC, is going through a rapid demographic expansion, meaning that a lot has to be built to keep up with the growth. But how do you transport building materials on roads that are unfit for cars and lorries? If you want to hear about the people of Goma's solution to this, join us next episode to talk with Théodore Treffon, who is an expert in governance and natural resource management at the museum. This series is brought to you by the Royal Museum for Central Africa in Belgium, which is a museum and a cross-disciplinary scientific institution with over 80 scientists from biology, earth sciences and social sciences conducting research on Africa and its heritage around the world.